Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. This week, the ups and ups of the price of oil. Are the media pumping up the story of a crisis?
We are at a gut-wrenching transformation point.
Murder, he wrote. The case of the journalist and the killings he allegedly committed. British Muslims and the media. Were the police right to investigate the makers of this film?
We Muslims have been ordered to do brainwashing.
And the urban gymnast gearing up for the Olympic Games. Welcome back. It's the story that affects just about everyone on the planet. And when the price of oil approached the $140 a barrel threshold, the world's media had to decide how to cover the story. Is this oil crisis down to speculation, suppliers turning off the pumps to drive up the price, or is it a real shortage? What are we to make of the media's coverage of a truly globalized news story? That's our starting point this week: the media, the markets, and the slippery business of reporting the oil story.
Gasoline prices continue to rise. They hit another record high today. In just 6 years, the price has now tripled.
What goes up won't come down. No relief is to be found. Pay $4 a gallon, it's a crying sin. Ride off spinning wheels and all the oil companies win.
As the price of oil hits a new record high.
Sky-high gas prices looks like are causing us to make some changes.
It seems like there's quite a bit of confusion in the media as to what's driving all of this.
The oil market is plentifully supplied, and soaring crude prices are fake and imposed.
As the dollar gets weaker and the euro appreciates, we are seeing this rise in the price of oil.
But that reflects the fact that genuinely there's lots of confusion out there in the real world.
Maybe that is the case, that the media's treatment of the oil story is more confused than it is conspiratorial.
Or maybe it's just another media myth.
We are at a gut-wrenching transformation point.
Now, when somebody comes on TV and says, I think in a few months' time the price would reach $180 a barrel. Exactly. He's like adding fuel to an existing fire.
Our attention span is very limited. Our interest in the world is quite shallow. And so if you ask your typical journalist in Washington, what's going on, you basically get baby talk.
And gosh, I mean, how high is gas? Too high. And when I filled up my tank, is it $75? Do I have a heart attack? Yeah.
Stories don't get much more global than this one. News networks have covered the oil shock or protests over it in Nicaragua, Nepal, Cameroon, Indonesia, just about everywhere. The coverage has been long on heat. There's a lot of finger pointing out there, but short on light, not a lot of illumination on why this is happening.
Covering the oil price is difficult because it is a very wide-reaching subject. It has lots of different causes. You can't reduce it to a headline like we're running out of oil.
Here's a warning I bet you've heard over and over. The world is running out of oil.
You have to hedge that round with all kinds of caveats and explanations, and often that isn't done in the media, and it creates a misleading impression.
Kuwait's minister stopped to talk to the press, and he said basically, we've got to all stop looking for the bad guys.
The issue of gas prices.
The media is missing the point of the story, and they cover it almost like there's some injustice to people getting as much as they can for their resource, when in fact that's what the world market is all about.
You know, clearly these guys like the revenue.
There's a persistent sense of outrage in U.S. media coverage of any of the world's ills. It's all U.S.-centric, and I think the U.S. media tends to see anyone who inconveniences us anywhere in the world as a villain.
The way it is reported, you have apocalyptic headlines in the newspapers to capture the attention of the reader. Then you can say it contributes to the hype. It pushes the price up.
$4.07 a gallon.
If you ask bankers who are out there trading in oil, well, do you think the problem is speculation? Of course, they all say no. If you go off and you ask OPEC countries, well, is the problem that you're not supplying enough oil to the market? They say absolutely not. It's the speculators. If you go off to America and say, well, isn't the problem that you're just driving big gas-guzzling cars and you don't conserve enough? Of course, that idea doesn't go down very well either. So there's no neutral party when it comes to oil, and that's because oil is such a big part of everyone's lives.
This is NBC Nightly News.
The news media have covered this story before, most famously in 1973, when Arab members of the OPEC trading bloc cut off oil exports to Western supporters of Israel and then reduced production to drive prices up. Much has changed since then, including, to hear the media report it, the emergence of China, flexing its new industrial muscle, gobbling up dwindling supplies of oil.
But China, the world's second biggest consumer of oil, needs more, a lot more.
The media is justified in highlighting the great demand for oil from India and China, not because of some sinister reason or conspiracy. China and India are the new giants of industry.
And that obviously makes a difference. But China still consumes a fraction of the oil that the United States consumes. So perhaps China isn't as big as the media suggests.
Part of a plan to dramatically increase oil exports to China.
Ultimately, this story isn't as simple as the media suggest. But then, why should it be? Why would anyone expect that the story of a fossil fuel that was millions of years in the making be explained in a few sound bites?
I think by switching around, by jumping around, finding a new angle, taking a new approach, actually that might confuse people a little bit more on what's already a confusing subject.
If somebody really wants to figure this stuff out and spend a few hours at it, it is not all that difficult. But it means breaking away from 24-hour cable coverage. It means breaking away from the headlines on your newspaper. It means, you know, being an adult.
The media has a responsible role to play. It must really calm down and report the full picture, not to pin the blame on one direction or another.
We got to get serious about this. This is like World War II.
It's much easier to rant and rave about the Arabs, you know, and how terrible they are, or the rich sheiks, or Hugo Chavez, or Putin, and make them the enemy. But it does not address the issue at hand.
I just can't take it.
Which is unfortunate, because the issue at hand, the price of oil, is such big news. Our Global Village Voices now with their take on how the media report the rising cost of oil.
I think it's been thoroughly fair. If anything, it hasn't gone far enough into the possible consequences of fuel prices increasing to the level that some people fear that they will. If anything, the media coverage has erred on the side of caution. The Saudis came out the other day and said that we have to expect expensive oil and expensive fuel really forever now, because it's a geological problem, and fuel will become more and more expensive to produce because oil is more and more difficult and more expensive to get out of the ground. But this will have a tremendous social impact because we won't be able to run transportation on the level that we can now, and the consequences are anybody's guess.
With regard to my opinion as to the current reporting of what's happening in the oil industry, I don't think the media is being sensationalistic. Journalists, be it print or television, are reflecting national priority, national need, and I do think there is always an element of cultural bias.
We're always open to direct on-air feedback from our viewers on the state of the world's news media. Just email us at listeningpost@aljazeera.net and we'll find a way to get you on the air as one of our Global Village Voices. Our Newsbites section this week starts with some troubling news for the Saudi and Egyptian governments. Their plans to rewrite the rules for satellite broadcasters in the Arab world have run into difficulty. 4 more governments, Oman, Bahrain, Syria, and the United Arab Emirates, have now joined Lebanon and Qatar in refusing to ratify a code of broadcast conduct that the Saudi and Egyptian governments proposed in February. The new rules were seen by their critics as an attempt by Cairo and Riyadh to rein in pan-Arab broadcasters like Al Jazeera, whose reporting is sometimes critical of those governments. Read between the lines of that story on those recent Israeli military exercises over the Mediterranean, and there's some interesting roundabout reporting going on there. Stories published in U.S. newspapers quoted Pentagon officials saying the war games were a dress rehearsal for a possible Israeli attack on Iran. Israeli journalists are banned by military censors from breaking stories like this one. What they often do, and may well have done in this case, is leak what they know but cannot report to American officials. Then they steer U.S. reporters to those officials, wait for the U.S. newspapers to break the story, and then quote those U.S. papers in their own papers when they report the news to Israeli readers. And there's not much the Israeli military censors can do about it. Police in Macedonia are saying that a journalist who reported in great detail on 2 murders had inside information. They accuse him of being the killer. Police charged Vlado Teneski with the murders after, they say, he reported some classified information that only the police were privy to. They charged Teneski, who was later found dead in his jail cell. The police are calling it a suicide, a tacit admission of the suspect's guilt. Relatives of the victims say that Teneski visited some of them after the killings, reporting, he said, for his newspaper. One of the best-known news anchors in the Philippines has been released after a kidnap ordeal that lasted a week. Ces Drilon of the ABS-CBN network and her cameraman say they were abducted by the Islamic militant group Al-Harakat al-Islamiyya when they tried to meet with the group's leader. There were reports the kidnappers threatened to kill their victims and wanted more than $300,000 in ransom. Police officials maintain no ransom was ever paid. And some new numbers are out this week that confirm how the Iraq war story has disappeared from the radar screens of some major U.S. TV networks. According to Andrew Tyndall, a news consultant who monitors nightly newscasts in the U.S., the 3 main networks, ABC, NBC, and CBS, average a little more than 2 minutes of coverage of the Iraq war per week, despite the fact that there are 150,000 U.S. soldiers there. One of the networks, CBS, has confirmed it no longer has a full-time correspondent in Iraq and just flies people in, quote, when a story merits it, unquote. Recently, a CBS correspondent appeared on The Daily Show on the Comedy Central network in the U.S., complaining about how hard it was to get an Iraq story on the air and joking about the lengths she sometimes had to go to.
I'm holding the armor-piercing RPG. It's aimed at the bureau chief, and if you don't put my story on air, I'm going to pull the trigger.
Lara Logan is CBS's chief foreign correspondent. She was in New York because she's based there. We're back after the break with a story on some filmmakers who made a documentary about militant British Muslims and then found themselves in trouble with the police.